Hello, everybody. Okay, I'm in the mic. Great. Okay, we're going to start because it's 5. I'm here to introduce Dr. Mary Heskel, who left Minnesota yesterday, and because of the storms, got here at noon today. Had a nice little pit stop in North Carolina. So Dr. Mary Heskel is an associate professor of biology at Macalester. She has a bachelor's from Penn in biology and art history, a master's in education from City College of New York, which she got while she was teaching science in New York City. She has a PhD in ecology, evolution, and environmental biology from Columbia. Among other things, Mary spends her free time knitting winter wear for her family and just generally crushing it in all the New York Times puzzles. I added her as a friend today. She's really good at Wordle. Although Mary's originally from Florida, when I met her in grad school, all of her fieldwork brought her north of the Arctic Circle, and she currently lives in Minnesota, where she just got like 3 feet of snow when we had our non-weather day. And since moving to Minnesota, she's also added some amazing urban ecology work to her Arctic research agenda. And we get to hear about all of that today. So thank you, Mary.
Hi. Thank you so much, especially to Steph and Nancy, for hosting and bringing me to the University of Richmond. I've never been here before, so I'm very excited. I'm going to talk to you today about plants, carbon, and climate change from the Twin Cities to the Tundra, but I'm really going to emphasize the urban part of my research and just give you like kind of a teaser of the Arctic stuff because the data is in process. So for those of you who don't study plants, you might be asking why plants? If you're interested in global issues, like why would you start with plants? This is a picture from last year's fieldwork in Arctic Norway, by the way. Well, I heard there's another plant physiologist in the room. Okay, so you're not asking why plants, but some of you in the audience might be. So when I think of plants as their function on Earth, which is robust in terms of primary production, but they're also a conduit of energy and carbon from the abiotic or non-living world to the biotic world. So it's kind of that first step of carbon, and I think of this as a very magical process. This is the enzyme ribisco right here, where inorganic carbon dioxide, the same thing we're exhaling right now, can be fixed or taken up by this enzyme and transformed into an organic compound. And this is the basis of, I would say, most life on Earth. All right? So if not their metabolism, something is eating a plant that has that kind of metabolism. I also think about plants because plants don't move, right? So they're stuck in one place. That makes them easier to study than animals. This is a machine called a Lycor 6800. This is in Alaska. But plants, because they don't move, they monitor, respond to, and document their environment. So they're kind of monitors of the surrounding environment, whether it's the same or whether it's changing. And this makes them really great tools to ask questions about climate change. All right, so I was like, oh, what are some good overarching statements about what I do? And I think this drives a lot of it, where I think about what questions can we ask and what measurements match those questions to understand how the world is responding to climate change. And I look at that through a plant lens because of their role in energy and carbon. And my specific disciplinary focus is plant physiological ecology or ecophysiology. I think there is some nuance actually between them, but not necessarily for this audience. And what that means is I use tools from plant physiology to assess environmental and biological impacts on how carbon is cycled and stored in ecosystems. So I'm thinking about plants and what they do in their metabolism under different variable climates, all right, and then see what that says about like a larger scale. Other plant physiological ecologists might actually zoom in closer and think about how plants respond to their environment and then look at the underlying genomic basis of that, but I kind of scale out from the plant. So if you think, when I kind of visualize my research, I'm definitely an Arctic ecologist. I've done a lot of work in the Arctic and continue to do work in the Arctic. And I do plant ecophysiology, which I just explained. And I think about both kind of the overlap. So a lot of my projects kind of fall in that little Venn in the middle. And both of these things are impacted by climate change. So most of the questions that I ask address direct impacts of variable climate, drought, and warming, all right? But since I would say what I'm presenting today kind of falls in this new area, which I would say is more place in student-centered research. And this is, I was thinking, a liberal arts college effect. So you all in this room are representing the University of Richmond, which is also a liberal arts college. And I've, as Steph mentioned, I've been trained at R1, or really high research institutions, and I work at an institution that has 2,500 undergraduates and no graduate program. And some people might think of that as limiting in terms of what they can get done, because I can't have postdocs or grad students. But I would say it's actually expanded my research in a number of ways. And like all of the things I'm going to show you are kind of methods that are new to me post-postdoc, all right? So this is post-Macalester stuff. So my research has both expanded in topics, locations, and the methods I use, all right? And I think that's because I'm around students that are getting interdisciplinary training, not just in a single, all of their classes are in a single discipline, and it allows them to ask kind of novel questions and guide the research as well. So kind of coming back, I'm gonna like draw you back into this question. So I'm gonna think about I'm gonna present basically like 4 different research topics that address different questions and use different methods or measurements to kind of address those. This is, again, an image. This is from the title slide as well, but this is where we're measuring the impacts of ash removal in St. Paul, which I did with students over 2 summers, and then this is from last year in a regrowth forest in Finland, in Arctic Finland. All right, so the plan for today, or for the next 45 minutes or so, is to present a few different kinds of research focuses. And again, these are kind of like new methods and new questions for me since joining a liberal arts college. So the first story I'm going to talk to you about is using modern radiocarbon to track fossil fuels, modern plant radiocarbon. I'm next going to talk about urban air quality and historical legacies from space. So because Steph invited me, I was like, oh, I have to talk about remote sensing, even my my attempts at remote sensing. A case study that I just mentioned about ash tree removal in St. Paul and kind of the role of the urban canopy in mediating impacts of climate. And because I'm doing so much Arctic research lately, I wanted to throw in a couple slides about what we've been up to for the last couple years. So for all of these studies and topics, they were, with the exception of the Arctic, the urban ones were inspired from observing where I live, all right? So I'm new to the Midwest. I grew up in Florida. I've lived in Philadelphia and New York and Providence, and now I'm in St. Paul. So you kind of like keep your eyes open. And again, these are undergraduate-centered research. So I'll give a shout out on the next slide, but I've been able to hire and integrate a lot of different students into my research programs during the year and also during the summers. And then the Arctic research is our interdisciplinary NSF grants that I'll talk about later. All right, so here's our urban ecology research team. So a lot of them have moved on since college. Elizabeth, whose honors thesis actually drove 2 different publications, is finishing a master's at UW-Madison. Jennings went into a master's in public history at the University of Minnesota. Saito finished a master's in biostats at Penn. Shami Shu is not a student. She's a collaborator who runs radiocarbon samples at the Keck Lab at UC Irvine. And then Chloe, Romeo, Lucas, Connery, Sophie, Ben, and Aiden are more recent graduates that work on, and current students that worked on the ash removal project. So this is kind of just giving a shout out to my collaborators here. So again, the first project I'm going to talk about modern radiocarbon, which is a totally new method to me, and something that I've been curious about just scientifically for a while and wanted to be able to use it for a new question. And again, this is kind of a liberal arts effect. So I would say getting out of your silo and comfort zone of, for me, which was like leaf level gas exchange, where I make most of my measurements. So the radiocarbon story began when I was driving around in St. Paul, roughly in 2020, probably around that summer. And this is, as you're driving kind of into, this is like downtown St. Paul. It's roughly the same size as Richmond. And if you're not familiar with it, the Twin Cities are kind of adjacent to each other. That's the name. And the Mississippi River kind of splits them in parts, but not all. So there's kind of a large highway that passes through St. Paul and 2 large highways that pass through Minneapolis. All right, so I was driving around with my husband, and as a new transplant, I would say, to St. Paul, we moved there in 2018. We've been learning a lot about the history of the city. There have been a lot of industrial changes, policy changes, population changes, and development changes. This is an image of the Ford plant, which is now a kind of a multi-use, like living commercial area, but for almost 100 years was a plant where they made Model Ts and then other Ford cars, so it was heavily industrial. And then there are two famous neighborhoods that were black communities that were relocated and displaced due to highway building in the 60s, early 70s or so. So we have like huge swaths where the highways were built, I guess in the mid-1960s, that kind of displaced like massive middle-class black neighborhoods. All right. So again, like when you move somewhere new, it's good to like learn the history of the place and for context. And then another benefit is I'm married to a geoscientist, so I asked him about this kind of like very nuanced topic about modern radiocarbon. That's called the Seuss effect, like Dr. Seuss, but a different Dr. Seuss. Not the same. That would be very impressive. So the Seuss effect is this special kind of like nuance to data that you use from modern radiocarbon. And I'm not going to read this, but this is just like how it's described in the literature by Keeling. And if any of you are Keeling curve superfans like me, it's the same Keeling. All right, so which tracks the oscillation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in Mauna Loa, Hawaii, which I teach in like every class because I think it's so cool. All right, so but what the Seuss effect does is it kind of looks at a ratio of radiocarbon, so C14, to stable or dead carbon isotope, and attributes those differences to the amount of fossil fuels in the atmosphere of that area. All right, and just to go into a little more depth, because it's an interdisciplinary room, we can talk about chemistry too, but this is, for those of you who haven't taken chemistry recently, all right, a majority of carbon on Earth is carbon-12. That means it has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons, right? So the neutrons plus protons give it the weight of 12, all right? Plus a little bit that we attribute to electrons. Carbon-13 is a stable isotope, all right? And that has 7 neutrons. So you just add a little bit of weight by adding a neutron. And then carbon-14 is much less present on Earth's surface or in the atmosphere, all right? So nearly 99% of all carbon is carbon-12, 1% roughly is carbon-13, and then 0.1% or less than that is carbon-14. So it's a really tiny amount of carbon, and it's heavy, all right? It's also not stable, all right? The thing that's famous about carbon-14 is that it decays at a really well-documented rate. Plants assimilate carbon. That's, again, why I think plants are so cool, is they're taking this carbon from the atmosphere, they're assimilating it through photosynthesis, and then they're storing it in their tissues or metabolizing it. And plants fractionate. So fractionate, another word they use is called discriminate, but it means they selectively choose carbon in a way that C14 is going to be reflective of what's in the atmosphere. All right, so they do kind of select it different ways. Like one plant might be a little looser about taking up C14 than another based on its photosynthesis, but roughly they're taking up CO2 in a bulk way that it'll reflect kind of what's out there. All right, and what else do we know about 14C? When have you heard it in other contexts? Question to the audience. When do you hear about radiocarbon? What fields would you hear about radiocarbon in? Besides like chemistry? Yeah, paleontology, dating, anything where you have an organic substance and you want to know how old it is, up to like roughly 40,000 years, you can use radiocarbon because we know if this much existed and then it decays at a known rate, you can see where it might fall on that rate and say like, oh, this was probably made like 15,000 years ago if it was like pottery or a tooth shard or something like that. So that's usually how we think about radiocarbon. But there's also modern radiocarbon, so stuff we're kind of thinking about in a different way. So 14C can be used to track fossil fuel-derived carbon in plant tissue. all right? And the way it does this, and this is the Seuss effect thinking, all right? So 12C and 13C, these stable isotopes, meaning they don't decay, they're always in the same amount, all right? They don't disappear with time. They are stable, all right? Whereas 14C decays over a known rate. So how old are fossil fuels? Ballpark. Are they older than 40,000 years? Yeah, they're millions of years. Some of them are hundreds of millions of years old, right? So is there any 14C in fossil fuels? No, it's all gone. It decayed it decayed in dinosaur age. Like it's been decayed. It's only dead carbon. So when we burn fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, oil, all of the emissions are only 12 and 13C. So we're actually flooding our atmosphere with more dead carbon or stable isotope carbon, so that proportion of 14C to stable C is shifted, all right? And this varies spatially too. So areas with more pollution from fossil fuel combustion, which is old carbon, that dead carbon, have air with more dead carbon and lower proportional radiocarbon, all right? So you can do some fancy math, and I didn't have to do it myself. Xiaomei did that for me because she ran the samples at UC Irvine. There are only a few places in the country that actually run radiocarbon samples. There are like 4 maybe. And so if you're exposed to more emissions, you're going to have a bigger denominator here because you have more stable carbon compared to your radiocarbon. So this proportion, which is represented with this del 14C value, a lower value is going to mean there's like a higher fraction of fossil fuels in your carbon. All right, so more industrial emissions or burning of fossil fuels changes this ratio. That ratio is going to be integrated into leaves through photosynthesis. And I'm not like the first person to come up with this by any means. Here's Xiaomei, an earlier paper she was on. Sue Trumbor's is like the queen of I would say, carbon, radiocarbon, modern radiocarbon in biogeochemistry. This is a paper from a while ago. It was about 2007, where they literally drove around the country in a van with some undergrads, and every time they saw a cornfield, they'd get out and grab a corn leaf and keep driving, and then they had a GPS location, and they ran all of those leaves for radiocarbon and then calculated the relative emissions contribution of carbon in those leaves. And you can kind of make a spatial map of like hot spots of where there's more carbon emissions versus less. All right, so just again, kind of like based off leaves here, which I think is a really cool study. And this has also been looked at in intra-urban areas, which is something I was interested in because I wanted to get more into urban ecology. So this tool has also been applied. This is in Rio de Janeiro, and you can see, again, they're sampling the same kind of leaf, and they're looking at patterns of del 14C in this leaf to attribute how much emissions, like where are the emissions based on just like sampling a leaf, instead of having like an expensive monitor that would look at real-time emissions. So again, I was just driving around being like, okay, what is the history of this new city I live in, and could I use this kind of novel Seuss effect and radiocarbon method, so that measurement and these questions, to think about like what kind of emissions profile exists within St. Paul. So I wanted to see if these signals could indicate a level of fossil fuel derived carbon emissions, and does this correspond to historic neighborhood categories defined nearly a century ago. So I applied historic redlining as a spatial categorization of assumed fossil fuel exposure. All right, and again, I borrowed from your tools. So mapping inequality is a invaluable resource that was developed. Is anyone in the room? I don't know. Yeah. But so this is as you know better than I do, it's a set of shapefiles that you can download for every city that was redlined, and be able to do different kind of like data analysis within those. So we used the shapefiles for St. Paul specifically, which is here, and there's Minneapolis. You can see how they're close, and then the river goes through. And I wanted to see like, oh, do these historical categories between green, blue, yellow, and red imply anything about what we're seeing with modern day emissions as calculated through Leaves radiocarbon? All right, and as many of you in the room already know, redlining has been tied to a lot of different environmental features, including a higher impervious surface cover, a lower tree cover, higher likelihood of highway development. So this is looking at Minneapolis here. The highway that I showed a picture of earlier today splits right through here, all right, through these redlined neighborhoods. And this has also been tied to air quality, human health outcomes, and climate change impacts of today, even though these were policies that have been banned by the Fair Housing Act over 50 years ago. So I worked with a student, Elizabeth, to kind of think of our sampling plan. This was like in 2020. We weren't actually allowed to even be in the same car together. So this was very like remote sensing or like remote work. But we looked at parks. I wanted to focus on two different species. So we looked at ash trees and dandelions, which are annuals. So everything grows up that season, versus ash trees, which might use stored carbon from a previous year. And we looked at places. You can see even though this is like a neighborhood now that's residential, you can see that there's a railroad track right there. So like, a generation ago, this might have been a more industrial area. And there are schools that are right next. So again, this is kind of where 94 splits. There's public parks and stuff, and this is a high school over here. So we only sampled in places where we thought people use, like for recreation, day to day. Then we sent off all these samples and found that, so this is ash over here, and then this is dandelion here. And then the color denotes the redlining category. And then this is the Del 14C. All right, so a lower value is going to imply a more emphasis a higher contribution of that dead carbon. So potentially a higher local effect of more fossil fuel burning in that area. And we can see this species have like a slightly different pattern. So this is distance from major roadways. So we were counting 4-lane traffic or highways. All right, so any kind of, even like a local road, but if it was like wide enough and had like a high traffic. And we found that, unsurprisingly, redlining and distance to major roads were covaried because often the major roads were built through redlined neighborhoods. And they collectively control emissions exposure as identified through leaf samples. All right, so if you look at just the dandelion, which is more of a snapshot because they grow only in one season, right? They're not using stored carbon as much as a tree would. You can see as you get past about 500 meters, even though there's green in here too, the distance from highway really, the leaves are integrating within a city. So a lot of the studies in the past, like I showed with both the corn study and also the Rio de Janeiro study, they were looking across like many kilometers of data. We're probably looking here within, 5 kilometers tops from end to end. So we're trying to see like what's the sensitivity of the ability for these leaves to kind of document their surroundings. And we found them to be highly sensitive, especially for the dandelions. And this ended up being the second, so Elizabeth, who was an undergraduate that worked with me for 2 years, and then Romeo, Jennings, and Saito are all undergrads as well. This ended up being a kind of like the chapter 2 of her honors thesis that we were able to publish after she graduated too, which was fantastic because I was like, oh, it's just kind of like just an idea at one point, and then we got to kind of work together and get all the data going to make it happen for a paper. But you can, unless you have a van full of undergrads driving around the country picking corn, it's actually hard to expand this. Like radiocarbon's actually really expensive too to run. Each sample is probably at least $100. So I wanted to think like, well, what's happening in St. Paul? Can we expand this to think about other Midwestern cities that again have this like different history of industrialization? Like we're kind of like post-peak industry in the Midwest, where there was a lot of like car manufacturing. There's less car manufacturing in cities like St. Paul now. So there's kind of like this transition where you might see a higher population, but less fossil fuel emissions due to different industries. So kind of to see how we can track that in a way that's a little more spatially robust. So I wanted to see if we could generalize our findings about emissions and historic redlining, and maybe use some new methods at the time, because why not use new methods, right? So this brings us to using remote sensing, which I know many in the room are practitioners of, and kind of thinking about it in terms of urban air quality. So again, the lived experience of people that are citizens and community members of Midwestern cities. And this was inspired by Hoffman et al. In 2020, who was actually in, yeah, exactly. I was like, I taught this in class, and this is Richmond here, like as the example, where you can see there's an association with land surface cover increasing, tree canopy cover decreasing, and impervious surface cover increasing in as you go from green to red neighborhoods in Richmond, but also it was across the entire 108 U.S. urban areas using this great shapefile. All right. So I was thinking, like, what are the implications under continued climate change? All right. So these cities are getting warmer. They're facing more extreme weather events. I mean, not to say, yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of increased warming in this region as well. So Elizabeth, Jennings, and Saito, again, this was work that took place mostly in 2020, 2021. We focused on using remote sensing as a tool to focus on the impacts of redlining. All right. So, and this was also remote sensing. So Elizabeth, I mentioned. We had a year of remote teaching at Macalester. You might have also had that at Richmond. You might not have. And so I was shepherding Elizabeth through remote sensing, which I'm not an expert in, through Zoom, like this entire time. So again, like I give so much credit to all of these students for kind of like coming together literally through screens to kind of pull off this kind of research. The driving question for this was looking at how nitrogen dioxide varies within and amongst Midwestern cities. So we focused on a different fossil fuel. So we're not looking at, or a different emitted fossil fuel, so not CO2 anymore. And the reason we focused on NO2 is robust, all right? So it's one of the most abundant urban pollutants. It's associated with increased risk of asthma, stroke, hospitalization for respiratory and cardiac issues. And it comes from both agricultural sources and combustion, like industrial combustion. So that might be a big player in the Midwest, where if you're not in a city, you're probably close to an agricultural area. And it can also increase ground level ozone concentrations, which also have negative health implications. And there's a disproportionate burden of air pollution in lower income and non-white communities. So these are some papers, I think these are both from PNAS, looking at kind of differences in nitrogen dioxide pollution during the pandemic, and also kind of this disparity in exposure versus consumption patterns across the US. So again, it has these negative health outcomes, but it's not happening in a blanket uniform manner. And to study kind of the impacts in these cities, we used data from Tripomi, which is on the Sentinel-5P satellite, where it observes columnar densities of tropospheric gases. Again, I'm like a plant physiologist, so this is like way outside of my wheelhouse. And we looked at these three different gases that are often from, they're kind of environmental pollutants that also can occur naturally. So carbon monoxide, ozone, and nitrogen dioxide. The data that I'm going to show you only includes nitrogen dioxide because when we submitted this paper and it went through review, the reviewers agreed that the pixel size for these two were too large to kind of say something robust about the red line neighborhoods. All right, so there was like a spatial mismatch that kind of didn't allow us to speak in a lot of detail. However, NO2, you can see here, has the smallest pixel size, was good to go. So we kind of trimmed down our research, but there are slides that look like all of the ones, but for both of them. All right, so our research approach, again, all through Zoom, included using these shapefiles from mapping inequality and importing them into Google Earth Engine, which Elizabeth taught herself, which was amazing. And we imported the 2019 Tripome data set. We did this work mostly in 2020 and 2021, but as you saw in that paper title, a lot of things happened during COVID and the pandemic that really altered both industrial activity and traffic patterns that we thought 2020 was just a weird enough year that we wanted to use the most recent year that didn't include like a global pandemic. All right, so that was 2019. And we only focused on nitrogen dioxide for the spatial resolution reasons. And then we analyzed NO2. There's a lot of more details between these two steps that I'm going to gloss over. But we analyzed these in R, so we can download the data from Google Earth Engine and do the analysis in R by looking at the Hulk code, or the redlining green, blue, yellow, and red codes of those neighborhoods. And then we compared within and across cities for 11 Midwestern cities. And we decided to focus on the Midwest for a few reasons. One, we had to cut things down in some regard. This isn't a postdoc, this isn't a whole lab effort. This was like me and an undergrad who don't know remote sensing, just like going for it. So we're like, you know what, we wanted to complement our work on radiocarbon. So we're like, well, let's do St. Paul, Minneapolis, Chicago, and then we're like, okay, let's just look at like the most populous Midwestern cities within a geographic range. And another reason that we focused on the Midwest was, again, kind of like the climate. We didn't want the climate to be too variable, and we didn't want the environment around those cities to be too variable either. And all of these cities are, again, they're highly urban, but many of them are fixed within kind of like an agricultural surrounding. So we kind of wanted to have that instead of comparing like Los Angeles, which has a totally different climate and surrounding environment, to Detroit, right? Like it's hard to compare apples to oranges. So we focused on these, and we calculated, again, using the mapping and inequality data, kind of like the percent A, B, C, and D in spatial coverage, just to see, like, is there, you know, like all of these cities had these different categorizations, but did some of them have more in the C and D, or which are the yellow and red categories, than others? You can see that's definitely true in the case of like Kansas City and Indianapolis, where like a majority of the city's spatial extent was categorized in those, which is different than, say, what is that, Omaha, right, where it's like 52% was in B, or which is the blue category. So across all cities, we found that so the colors are based on the whole category, so A, B, C, D, but also green, blue, yellow, and red. So this is in Dobson's units, which is a kind of a units for these gases that is representative of their amounts in this large column in space. And we found that across all cities, the highest values of NO2 were in the D neighborhoods. So this is across all of those 11 cities. So like looking across the entire year of 2019, so not dividing up by month, which there were actually some cool patterns in that we didn't dive too deep in. It was higher in winter, which is interesting. But we saw kind of like a higher amount in the D, and then, so the alphabetical notation, if the letters are different, they're statistically significant. So blue is higher than green, yellow is higher than green, and red is higher than blue and green. So that's one way to see it. Even though the bar graphs look very similar, there's so much data underlying these that it turns to be significant. When we broke up all of the cities individually, there was a lot more variation that I think there's like more to dig into here. You can see Chicago, there's statistical significance. So again, if there's no shared letters, or if the plots, the box plots, don't share a letter, they're significantly different from each other. So you can see red was significantly higher than a B and C, or green, blue, and yellow. Whereas Cleveland, everything was the same except for red, where it was higher. Columbus, no difference. Detroit, no difference. So you can say there's like variation depending what you're looking at. I was very cagey, I would say, about promoting this, because I didn't want people to look at this and say, oh, there's no difference. Like, everything's the same. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, like, why would we need to invest in greater air quality equity or environmental justice initiatives if they're the same? I will provide you the same caveats that this is NO2 data that's measured not at the ground level, all right? It's measured in the atmosphere well above like what we're experiencing that would affect our, all of these negative public health outcomes. So I think it's kind of like a test that you could use as a first pass to understand like, okay, what's the spatial variation of air quality within a city, like a massive city like Chicago, where you can see this is the NO2 data here, where you can see hotspots, and this is the redlining map. While this isn't like a quantitative comparison, it's just for visualization, you can see kind of where that hotspot is compared to like the north suburbs and kind of down here. It kind of varies a little bit as well. But I wanted to emphasize, like, this is something that you can look at from space, and it might allow you to kind of inform where to put ground level sensors. All right, ground level sensors are super expensive. A lot of cities might just have one or two at the airport or city hall or somewhere where people aren't really spending a lot of time, not necessarily like where do they go to sleep at night, whereas those are the risks that people are facing the most, like continued exposure to high levels of these pollutants. So across all the cities, we're seeing kind of across all the cities, we're seeing a 7.3% increase, but this really varies a lot. No change again in St. Paul, 16.2% increase in Chicago. And we thought that this might be explained by how big the cities are, the traffic patterns, the spatial extent, populations, et cetera. And then we also found that the highest C and D by area proportion, so those percentages, are related to the biggest differences. So if you have more red and yellow lined historic areas, you're more likely to have a difference in the air quality of 2019. Again, many, many years after redlining ceased to be legal. All right. My next urban case study, hard pivot, is looking back at St. Paul. So again, back in my backyard, at ash tree removal and kind of implications for the lived experience of people in the cities. And this is focusing on an invasive insect called the emerald ash borer, which I'm sure is in Richmond because it's pretty much everywhere in North America up into the Rockies, and it's actually been spotted in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle as well. So it's this extremely disruptive introduced species that can kill an ash tree within years of first infestation. And these are woodpecker holes, but you also see these like tiny like D-shaped holes on ash trees. So it becomes very easy to identify infested trees. So St. Paul has removed about 30,000 ash trees, and St. Paul's not a big city, again, so it's roughly the same space and population as Richmond, so we're not talking about Chicago here. And they removed 30,000 trees in about 15 years. So it really devastated the urban canopy. And again, St. Paul's a place that, like, not all houses have air conditioning. Like, they're used to, like, historic climate norms that aren't really happening anymore. So when it's hot in the summer, there's no coastal breeze, and a lot of the houses get extremely hot. So how urban community members deal with heat is kind of an increasing justice issue as well. I thought this was also a really interesting natural experiment for urban ecology. Like, what happens if you take out 20% of the canopy? Like, period. Like, that's like something you would never be able to do in an NSF grant or anything. Like, I just want to remove all these trees and see what happens. But this was actually kind of city protocol to make sure they're dealing with both infested trees and trees that are about to be infested, because they're a big security risk. You can't just have a bunch of standing dead trees in a city. So street trees, as you know, have these like amazing benefits. They mediate the climate, both through direct shade and also the evapotranspirative cooling effects of plants. They can lead to household energy reductions. Maybe you don't need to run the AC all the time if you have a nice shady tree. It might increase the valuation of your home. And people, what we found all summer long for 2 summers was people have really deep connections to the street trees, even though it's not in their yard, if it's in front of their house. they think about it all the time. And when they were removed, people were really angry. Like, this is like, I would say I've been funded by NSF. I go to the Arctic. I do all these cool things. This is the project that the most people talk to me about, where they're like, oh, you did that? Like, whenever I say, like, oh, yeah, I saw the ash trees, they, like, want to talk for, like, 30 minutes about how these people came and removed their trees, and they're so upset, and how did this happen, and blah, blah, blah. They're deeply passionate about maintaining the urban canopy. So what I did with some of the students I introduced before, we tried to, quote, quantify this shade gap. So what are the impacts of ash removal on neighborhood environments? And all of these trees have been replanted, so they're saplings now. Trees are amazing. They live for, you know, generations of human time, but it takes a long time for them to get big. All right, so I wanted to see, like, how long is it going to take for these little trees to provide the benefits that the big trees that we just removed were doing so well. All right, so we looked, again, you'll come visit St. Paul now that you've seen the map like 20 times, but the removals are this is all of we got some GIS people in the room, I know that. We borrowed this, I saw this map online, had different colors, but from the city of St. Paul, and that was actually what triggered this like experiment for me, to be like, oh, they have all this on GIS, so like, I can just like ask someone, maybe they could give it to me, even though I don't know GIS. It's like my major failing in life. And like the guy was like, well, let me ask my boss, you know, and it's open data, it belongs to the city, you're a resident, whatever. And he's like, asked his boss, and he's like, yeah, sure, you can have this like amazing map of like the year and date of every located tree that they remove. And I was like, oh my gosh, this would like, because I had this idea, I was like, oh, what is going on with the canopy? But how would I even study that unless I knew where every single ash tree was? And then there it is, you know? So like we know where every ash tree was. All of these have been removed. The last removal year was 2 summers ago. And then Romeo Gomez, who was a student in my lab, who was very savvy at JS, made a lot of the maps for this project. So what we did was we looked at all of these. So these are political districts. So this is like a city council district, basically. And you can see where the ash trees are is not just like all clumped in one. All right, they're kind of widespread. And unlike redlining, like where a lot of the tree cover is, ash or known, is in many of the wealthier, whiter neighborhoods of St. Paul. So the fact that all of these ash trees were removed made the city somewhat more equitable in terms of tree cover, but like in the bad way, you know, like, so like the places with a lot of trees got less instead of the places with less trees getting more, all right? So it was kind of this weird evening effect. But what we did, this was cheap research, and I mean that in like the best way possible. I got student salaries through Macalester. I didn't really need that much equipment, to be honest, and we just like drove around the city and took data all the time, all right? This is so much, and again, like people wanted to talk to us nonstop. So we looked at streets that had no ash, which was our control, streets that had all ash and they had been decimated, predating the ash. The reason there would be streets with all ash is because the generation before that, they were all elm trees. And then the elm trees got removed, and they planted all ash, and now the ash trees are removed. And now they're planting more biodiverse streets because they don't want to have to deal with that again. And we looked at places where the canopy had been totally removed and then replanted with a sapling. And we measured a lot of biotic and environmental variables, including like how big the tree was, how tall it is, the species, how well it's doing, if it's replanted, is it thriving, et cetera. And then we also measured things like the direct light on the ground, on the sidewalk, and then under the tree, and then the temperature as well, to get kind of a land surface temperature. And I have a student working on this right now, Lucas, who graduated last year, that I rehired as a research tech. And this is a poster of his that he worked on with Connery Ritter a couple years ago, where they looked at these replanted trees. And 2024 was an extremely hot, dry year in the cities. And you can see this Kentucky coffee tree, which is more of a southern ranged tree that they're planting now for climate adaptation reasons. You can see that one was doing okay, but we've got a maple, all right, that you can barely see it because it has no leaves on it in July. All right, so not every replanted tree is withstanding these climate extremes that we're subjecting it to, especially when it's not growing up under a shaded canopy, right? It's just like out there by itself. So Lucas and Connery focused on kind of this like next generation of street trees that are going to take, 20 years to become mature, and which ones are doing well. And we used some models that had been published previously to see that there's some species are going to have higher mortality rates based on these like vitality scores we came up with than others. All right, so some there's kind of like based on how many there are and also how they're doing at a young age. And then Lucas has also been working on the data. This is looking at control. This is ash pre-removal, so a street that was about to have all the ash removed, after they were all removed, and then replanted with saplings. And on this side, which is your left, is what we're calling like the shade effect. So this is the relative contribution of like how much shade the canopy of those streets provide. All right, so a high value means the canopy provides a lot of shade, and a lower value means the canopy is not providing a lot of shade. And you can see there's the effects that you would expect, all right, but we got to put some numbers to it, which I think is, again, really helpful for an issue that is important to a lot of people in our neighborhoods. One positive thing about these graphs, and then this is looking at temperature as well. So an increased temperature means it's hotter. This is normalized to the whole city, so if we measured on a hot day versus a cold day, you could compare. So it's not actually like a degree Celsius or anything. So you can see with the removal of trees, it's hotter. Of course it is. But when you replant these tiny little trees, even if they're not all doing that well, we do have somewhat of a cooling effect. So it is kind of promising that maybe help is on the way and not we're out of luck for 20 or 30 more years. So we have a lot of data. We collected so much data and looked at, we got GIS data, we got public house value data to see if like there's an element of wealth that might buffer the effects of tree removal. We looked at private trees on land using Google Earth to see how big those private trees were and if there was any kind of like neighbor effects of not just the street trees, but of private land trees. And we looked at biodiversity effects too, and kind of like the replanting. And is this going to make things more equitable? So this is kind of like a work in progress, but I would say it was like extremely novel for me and not my background. All right, but this is again another hard pivot, but I wanted to kind of focus, the title and the abstract focused on Arctic stuff a little bit, so I wanted to make sure that you don't walk away thinking I just do urban ecology with methods that I've never tested before. I do a lot of other kind of things too, but I really enjoy working in urban environments for many reasons, one of which it feels like it allows me to connect with the city I live in. But a lot of my research actually takes me very far from home. For the last few years, I've been traveling to Arctic Finland and Norway, and also Arctic Alaska, where I did a lot of my PhD work as well. I'm part of two NSF grants. One, the bottom one is Navigating the New Arctic, which is an NSF program, and we focused on Fennoscandia, which is the Arctic regions of Finland, Sweden, and Norway. This grant, I put this dot here on the Yamal Peninsula of Russia because the grant was actually funded to take place there in 2021, and then in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Russia's been kind of scientifically isolated since then, so we could no longer do work in Yamal for many reasons. So we had to pivot to a place that also has traditional reindeer herding, which is part of this kind of interdisciplinary grant. And there are only a few places in the world that have traditional reindeer herding, including Fennoscandia and Greenland, and then like a very small part of Alaska. So a lot of the grant, if you look it up on the NSF website, it might still say Russia. But I've been going there for the last 3 summers and bringing students to this like gorgeous landscape. And then last summer and then for the next 4 years or so, I'll be going to Northern Alaska and Arctic Alaska as a part of this EVOM grant, which is a much more interdisciplinary within biology. All right, so we're thinking about like evolutionary change of different kinds of taxa under a warming gradient. And for those of you who aren't paying attention to the Arctic as much as I am, the reason that there's so much money and research and attention being focused on the Arctic is because it is warming faster than anywhere else on Earth's surface. All right, so this is a paper that gets cited a lot that came out in 2022. You can see this background trend here. All right, that's Earth, like all of Earth. And then these are models projecting and modeling Arctic warming. All right, so the Arctic's warming over 4 times faster than other latitudes. You can also see that portrayed here. So there's an amplification effect that allows this warming to accelerate that has a lot to do with sea ice, which maybe you learned about in another seminar. This is also having a big effect on vegetation because the seasons are getting longer, the snow is melting earlier and showing up later, and the permafrost is thawing. So you're getting this kind of greening effect where there's more vegetation. This is NDVI for the remote sensing crowd. But this is looking at vegetation change over the last 3 decades or so, 4 decades, where you're seeing this big kind of like amplified greening effect going along with the warming effect. So the projects, this is just like super teaser, but the projects I'm focusing on in the Arctic is looking at this gradient. So this is 15 sites all based around a creek. Tulik, which is a famous Arctic research site, is that little diamond in the middle. It's kind of hard to see. So we're looking above and below the Brooks Range, which is the highest latitude mountain range in the US, but it's kind of like a very far continuation of the Rockies almost. So it's above and below the Brooks Range. We called it like SOBRO, Bro, and NOBRO for north of the Brooks. And we looked using streams and all of these sites as replicates. We measured willows, all right, which are increasing in height and size due to this relaxed limitation of more warming, more nutrients over time. So we're measuring photosynthesis, which is something I'm actually trained and know the methods very well in, to see how these populations vary. And maybe are the southern species acting different than the northern species? And we have a lot of genomicists on the team actually from the University of Connecticut to see like, is there any kind of like genetic transfer across this mountain range that might allow some adaptations from the south to spread to the north and make them more warming adaptive. So the first step of this is data provided by Ian Schumann, who's a PhD student at Columbia that I'm co-advising, is looking at like what is going on with the photosynthesis here. And this is looking at 2 shrub species, and VC max is you can think of as like how like robust the photosynthesis is in terms of rubiscose, that enzyme carboxylation. So it's like how fast can rubisco carboxylate a molecule of CO2. So you see a lot of variation. I'm not going to go into like the this is from south to north. But what I wanted to point out is that the models that are portraying photosynthesis in the Arctic are using this red line as their kind of input. And what Ian shows very clearly here is that red line is not sufficient to document what is happening with this like huge increasing shrub population. So the rates are higher, and that might contribute to their growth and expansion in the Arctic. And then to hop over to give a little shout out to the Norway and Scandinavian project. This is Sarah Borer, who's about to graduate and is a student in my lab, focused on the impacts, again, that grant was very much about like reindeer herding and reindeer nutrition. There's reindeer like walking all over the place in Finland. It's pretty crazy. And they're all domesticated. They're herded animals. So all of those reindeer belong to someone, all right? And they are rounded up in the fall season, separated into like, this is your reindeer, this is my reindeer, and then they are used for meat, all right? So, but they herd openly during the summer range. And they herd all over the place, including on decommissioned mines, all right? So we had access to a decommissioned gold mining site, and we measured a lot of plant physiological attributes, and then also we were able to import the leaves that were dried back to the US and measure them for heavy metals to see like, well, if reindeer are openly grazing on this mine, are the mine plants okay? You know, like a lot of the reindeer herders were very concerned about what might be present in those leaves. And Sarah made this lovely plot which shows all of the heavy metals we measured, and if anything is beyond this blue or yellow line here, it means that the amount of that metal is enhanced, all right, in a statistically significant way. So you can see for over half of these metals, including some that might not have a negative effect, like iron necessarily, but like cobalt, titanium, silica, copper, etc., you're seeing this enhanced effect. So previous reports that the mine commission themselves showed no impact. So we're working with reindeer herders to translate this into Finnish, including Ida and Viola. We're actually in the US right now at a conference, who are both graduate students in anthropology and also traditional reindeer herders themselves. And they're going to help us kind of put this data together in a way that could be shared with the reindeer herders to talk about what we found. So my take-home messages is don't sleep on plants. A lot of times when people bring up, maybe not in this room, but like when I bring up plants sometimes in biology classrooms once in a while, everyone's kind of like, oh my God. But I would say plants are these sentinels and buffers against climate change. They help communities, and they also document what's going on. They're also really buffering the effects of warming by taking up all the CO2 from the atmosphere. I would also say to look for inspiration everywhere, all right, from your backyard and the cities you live in. Learn more about it, see what kind of questions you can ask to learn even more, and support federal funding of science. I know you guys feel that as much as we do all over the country, but a lot of this, some of this was cheap science and it was great, and a lot of this was really expensive funded science that was with hard-won grants. So this federal funding doesn't just support me in my professional life, but it supports all of those names you saw and all of those faces and all of those students that are kind of, might be their first step into a research career or whatever they do in the future. Also, I need to say a big thank you to Stephanie Spirit. I was trying to find a photo. Yeah, exactly. I was trying to find like a PG photo of all of us together, and like, so this, and Nancy for working and making sure this trip was so easy for me despite all of the travel issues. And you can see this is me on my wedding day. Clearly it's not just like grad school, and with my husband Will, and then there's Steph and our grad school gang. I know Chelsea was here like earlier, but it's really cool to like keep in touch with friends and see where we have similar jobs now. But I would say whenever this was like 10 years ago, I was like no one knew where they were headed next. So it's really exciting to like celebrate in person again. And then, oh no, I was wondering if this would work, but it didn't. It didn't on mine either. That's okay. Anyways, there was a picture of a bunch of people I worked with in Finland there, and then some students and collaborators from the EVOM team and all the students I just mentioned. And a lot of this funding came from Macalester as well, so including like open access funds for publications. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it depends on the time and money you have. I would say radiocarbon in leaves is both it's just a snapshot, all right? You're not getting high frequency data, but you could get a lot of spatial data, but it's expensive. So it depends on which like lever you're trying to tinker on. I think best case scenario, you have on the ground, high resolution, both spatial and temporal sensors like everywhere. But they're expensive, and people don't have that much money, especially cities, so they might not implement it. The best network that I saw that has a lot of on-the-ground sensors were through academic funding, actually. So it was like someone that wanted to study nitrogen dioxide in cities, and they wrote a grant either from NASA or EPA, again, all these like federal funding assets, and then they were saying like, okay, you can buy 20 sensors and set them up where you want in a way that would allow you to collect ground data. But and then you need to have people that can monitor them and use the data and stuff like that. So I was doing this more as like a proof of concept, like wouldn't it be cool if we could like use these plants? And I also wanted to potentially scale it into using tree cores to see if there was some way we could go back in time. So like if a tree integrates this kind of information in modern day, and we have modern day sensor data, and then we have modern day wood data, like the first ring, could we build up some kind of radiocarbon history that might link predating some sensors? I don't know, but I didn't get there. And I'm not a dendrochronologist, so it was hard. I was like, I can't do too many new things at once. But yeah, I would say sensors are better, but they're expensive. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah. The seeds would have carbon year to year. Yeah, so the seed carbon would, well, I mean, dandelions can probably have multiple generations even in a summer, you know, so it's not like the seed made in June might be able to germinate in August, you know, depending, they're very fast. So they will conserve, that carbon that's in the seed is going to be from the previous carbon collected from the leaves of the previous year. Yeah, so they do conserve carbon, but just in a much smaller window of time compared to a tree that might use stored carbon from wood to help budding or something. So you might find older carbon in leaves from trees than you would from like an annual, is an assumption. But yeah, but it's not exact, it's not so easy. But you'd have to do more than I did, I think, to figure out how, there are all these terms about like kind of like storage pools and new carbon versus like reserves and stuff. And there's a whole field of research, I think, about this like non-structural carbohydrates. So like what happens to the carbon they're not using right away? Does it just get stored for a few years? This is a digression, but there's a really cool paper about maple syrup actually, because like you can actually radiocarbon date maple syrup to see like, well, how old is this carbon in the sugar of the maple syrup? And in some trees, it's just like last year's photosynthesis. And in some trees under drought, it's like photosynthesis from like 5 years ago, because maybe they had to dig kind of deep to get that sugar because it's a drought. So it really varies even within trees too. Sure. Yes.
Stephanie, we mentioned this, but one of the things that we're finding is that temperature has a very strong spatial pattern, air quality, as you were showing, less so. I was curious about the data that you didn't publish, the other constituents, other than using carbon monoxide too, I think, or what other things. Was there differences in the spatial pattern even among the different meetings that you were able to?
Oh, like in the, I remember the results being pretty similar actually, but in review they were like, you can't say that much. Like it's just not, the pixel you're looking at is so big, like we're not gonna let this pass, yeah, basically. But I do remember them being similar for ozone and carbon monoxide, like a similar kind of like A to D difference. But again, like some of those pixels were like the size of the cities we were looking at, so it didn't feel appropriate. Yeah. And then some of the temporal stuff I had a student look at in class, and I remember winter being higher than summer and being like, oh, that's cool, and then just kind of like letting it sit for like a few years, like the thought. So I think there was like a different, all of this data is available online. Like we've had to publish the data set, so if you wanted to like tinker around, it's there, but it's linked in the paper. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
The results get a little messy. And so I wonder if you guys look at that in terms of addressing people, and I didn't do it because it's pain, but have actually like repopulating census data in those areas and then going out those kind of circles.
Yeah, again, I don't know how to do that, but I do remember these really great papers coming out around the time when we published that paper, and I was like, it was just like, there were so many, again, because of this resource of the shapefiles, I think it made it very straightforward to like categorize cities. And then these were papers that came out like while the paper was under review, basically, that I was like, oh, I have to add this like when we revise it and they were using more high resolution like census data. Within that, to kind of disentangle like modern demographics, not just like historic maps, which I think if I knew how to do that, that would be great. But we were doing too many new things at a time. But there were a lot of people kind of like, again, saying like, okay, here's one thing, but actually like who's living there now? Let's look at the modern census data. Let's see what's happening and like see like who's being affected within those spatial blocks, I would say, yeah. Right. Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's limitations in using it for modern studies, for sure. When we were coming up with it, I was modeling off of this. Again, this was like started in 2020, so I was like, I read the Hoffman paper and I was like, oh, that's cool, and these are available, and like, we can't do anything in person anymore. We were going to do all this field work, so I was like, what can we do that feels like we could actually accomplish it? So part of it is like a feasibility plan for a sampling design without having to know how to get into census data. And then people who do know how to get into census data, I think we're doing a better job. And that's another reason why we did like the distance to highway, because we're like, well, maybe it's not, like maybe red, green, yellow, blue is less important today. And it's just like, where are you in this like industrial / highway landscape? And that seemed even more important actually if you look at the graph here. Like a lot of these green neighborhoods are actually like pretty close to a highway, so they're acting the same. You know, it's really just like, okay, are you near a highway, are you not near a highway? And that's the real determinant. And red line neighborhoods are often near highways because of the history, but it doesn't mean they didn't clump perfectly. It was more like, where are you? So we had the first version of this graph was again just like the other ones where it shows like the 4 colors and the box plot and et cetera, and we're like, that's actually not showing that much. So like maybe it's more about where you are in this like traffic landscape, yeah, which is a little more informative about like the mechanism. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Like a bulk flow. Well, so if there's a lot of trees anywhere or any kind of like photosynthetic organism, you're going to see more carbon drawdown if they're doing well, right? So just if you have patches of, and CO2 is not like, I mean, it's a greenhouse gas, but like, it's not like bad for human health unless you're like actively suffocating, you know, like, but like you're, you know, like we're inhaling CO2 like right now. We've been in this room for a while. It's not like, you know, I was more concerned about is not like, oh, the presence of CO2 is bad for humans. It's just implying that if you are near a area of high CO2, you're probably near an industrial area or a highway that also has all this other stuff. So CO2 is easier to measure, but like NO2, carbon monoxide, very bad, ozone, particulate matter, stuff that you're like, oh, that actually is like bad for human health. But CO2 could be kind of like a potentially easier to measure and a marker of change. So yes, if there are a lot of trees somewhere compared to a place with no trees, they are going to be taking up more C14 as well as more C12 and C13 because that's what trees do. The ratio, however, is going to be dictated by how much of the fossil fuel emission CO2 is there. So more of the 12, so that ratio would be different versus a industrial high fossil fuel emitting area versus a low fossil fuel emitting area. Yeah, but it would take up, overall, it would take up more because that's what leaves like to do. They take up more. But the ratio would be different, I would say. And that's kind of what this is showing. So it's like, okay, if you're standardizing, you're all looking at the same leaf, but in some areas that ratio is different. because there's more fossil fuel. And in some areas, if you're in, whatever, western Nebraska, you're pretty far away from industrial activity. You're just getting less heavy isotope. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.